What's all this about the biggest scourge mankind has suffered? Well, welcome to this episode of What's All This, where we will consider the scourge of the Mediterranean. However, this scourge lasted for millenniums and affected civilization not only in the Mediterranean, but also much further afield across many nations. Whoever they encountered were inevitably plundered, slaughtered, or cast into slavery. Therefore, it surely qualifies as the most destructive human atrocity in the entire history of mankind. We are talking about the Barbary pirates. For centuries, mention of the Barbary pirates would send shivers down the spines of European sailors, merchants, and inhabitants of coastal locations all around the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and even up to as far as England and onto Iceland. These seafaring pirate raiders, who were primarily of North African origin, were not just pirates. Their method of operation was the most vicious and barbaric, without regard to the consequences this incurred on those who suffered from their plundering. They dominated the Mediterranean Sea from at least the 12th century, and eventually were stopped in the 19th century when they were overtaken by nations with better vessels and a will strong enough to challenge them head-on. The pirates' reign of terror encompassed widespread piracy, slave trade, and political influence, and would savagely butcher any that offered resistance, leaving an indelible blood-stained mark on history. The term Barbary referred to the North African coast, encompassing present-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, extending across the Mediterranean, reaching down the West African coast, and venturing as far north as Iceland in the North Atlantic. These regions were ruled by various independent states like the Ottoman Empire, Morocco, and Algiers, each harboring pirates who operated under their own flags. These pirates, also known as corsairs, were a diverse group, comprising Muslims, Christians, and even former slaves who had adopted their captors' way of life. Driven by the lucrative slave trade, their modus operandi was both brutal and efficient. Using swift, maneuverable vessels, they would viciously attack merchant ships, plunder cargo, and enslave the crew, capturing individuals of various ethnicities and religions, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims. These captured individuals were sold in North African slave markets, fetching high prices due to the constant demand for labor in the region's expanding empires. The pirates targeted not only Christian nations, but also Muslim ships, blurring the lines between religious conflicts and economic gain. Their activities weren't limited to the sea. They conducted razzias, which amounted to brutal raids on coastal towns and villages, which were primarily in Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. But their reach extended to the British Isles, the Netherlands, and even Iceland. While similar raids had occurred since the 8th century, the term Barbary pirates is primarily associated with the rise in frequency and ferocity from the 12th century onward. The 80-year period between 1580 and 1680 is particularly noteworthy, and estimated to have seen the capture of around 850,000 individuals as slaves, with some estimates reaching 1.5 million by 1780. The rise of the Barbary pirates coincided with a skillful seamanship and brutality that was unmatched, and also the decline of naval power in Europe. This created a power vacuum in the Mediterranean, allowing the pirates to flourish. They established impenetrable fortified bases along the North African coast, most notably at Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Sal. These formidable strongholds served as safe havens, allowing them to repair ships, store loot, and hold captives. They disrupted trade routes, hindering economic growth in Europe and hindering travel for pilgrims. The constant threat of capture affected everyday life and deterred many Europeans from even venturing into the Mediterranean, impacting cultural exchange and scientific advancement. Furthermore, the large-scale slave trade inflicted immense human suffering. Numerous Europeans, particularly from coastal regions, faced the constant possibility of being captured, enslaved, and forced into labor in atrocious conditions. However, the story of the Barbary pirates is not simply one of terror and destruction. They also played a significant role in shaping the political landscape of the region. Due to their ability to disrupt European trade and capture valuable resources, this afforded them great leverage in negotiations with European powers. Because they had become unstoppable, the Barbary pirates had now become a fully fledged business operation on a massive scale. This reached the point that several European nations, including France, England, and the Netherlands, were forced to pay annual tributes to the Barbary states to ensure safe passage for their ships. This system, known as tributes of peace, further solidified the pirates' influence and became a source of revenue for the North African states. The consequences of not paying the tribute was to risk entire ships being wrecked, with the passengers and crew either enslaved or hacked to pieces. The American Revolutionary War saw Barbary pirates, primarily from Morocco, now attacking American merchant vessels which were venturing into the Mediterranean. This posed a significant challenge to the newly independent American nation, which was already struggling from the massive costs of the Civil War it had been through. Prior to independence, the United States enjoyed the indirect protection of British treaties with the Barbary states. However, with the severing of ties with Britain after the Civil War, American ships now became targeted and vulnerable. Soon, reports of captured vessels and enslaved or slaughtered crews reached the shores of the newly formed American nation. Faced with this challenge, the American government, burdened by war debts, and lacking a significant navy, had no choice but to opt for diplomacy. The initial approach involved negotiations and tribute payments. In 1783, treaties were signed with Morocco and Tunis, securing safe passage for the American ships in exchange for annual payments. However, Algiers, considered the most aggressive of the Barbary states at the time, remained a thorn in America's side. Negotiations failed, and in 1793, Algiers captured American ships and butchered or enslaved their crews, demanding a hefty ransom for their release. This financial burden was significant, with the yearly tribute reaching a staggering 20% of the entire federal government's budget from 1795 onwards. It is undeniable these payments were a significant financial burden for the young nation. As American and European naval power grew, particularly with the adoption of powerful cannons on sailing ships, the Barbary navies, primarily reliant on heavier, slower vessels, became increasingly outmatched. By the late 17th century, European nations began pressuring the Barbary states to cease their attacks, leading to a gradual decline in corsair activity. While European powers with strong navies saw a decrease in attacks, nations without such protection continued to suffer well into the early 19th century. The first half of the 19th century saw sporadic incidents, including the Barbary Wars involving the United States. President John Adams, while seeing the need for a navy, continued a policy of appeasement, prioritizing lower defense budgets and avoiding confrontation. However, public outrage at continued attacks and the financial burden of tributes fueled a growing desire for a more forceful response. This sentiment gained traction under President Thomas Jefferson, who was much more focused on confrontation rather than appeasement and was a strong advocate for a robust navy. Recognizing the need for considerable naval defense, President George Washington signed the Frigate Act of 1794. This authorized the construction of 6 Navy frigates, and this became the backbone of the early U.S. Navy. These ships were designed for speed and maneuverability, ideal for combating Barbary corsairs' galleys. The newly formed U.S. Navy, though still growing, achieved early successes in the Caribbean against French privateers, boosting morale and demonstrating its potential. The Barbary War of 1801 to 1805, this war, now under President Jefferson's leadership, provided valuable combat experience for the young Navy. Leaders like Stephen Decatur and Edward Preble emerged as heroes, showcasing the American fighting spirit and the capabilities of the growing naval force. The U.S. Navy began incorporating advancements like carronades, short-barreled cannons with heavy firepower on its ships, giving them an advantage over the Barbary corsairs who relied on musketry. The Barbary War of 1815 to 1816, this conflict demonstrated the significant progress made by the U.S. Navy. Decisive victories over Algiers, culminating in the decimation of the city in 1816, forced the Barbary state to end its practice of demanding tribute and enslaving American citizens. The Barbary Wars solidified the U.S. Navy's reputation as a capable force and marked a turning point. The nation's commitment to building a strong navy not only secured its freedom of navigation, but also laid the groundwork for its future role as a global maritime power. The financial burden of forced tributes for safe passage had compelled the U.S. to build such a robust navy. The United States truly began to flex its naval muscles with the Barbary Wars of 1801 to 1805 and 1815, to 1816 serving as the beginning of the end of the Barbary pirates. These two Barbary Wars significantly weakened the Barbary states and instilled fear in the region's remaining pirate havens. However, the final blow for the pirates did not come until the French conquest of Algeria in 1830, marking a permanent end of the era of Barbary piracy and its devastating impact. Long-simmering tensions between France and the Dey of Algiers, who was the leader of the Ottoman Regency of Algiers, reached a boiling point in 1827. A diplomatic incident involving a fly whisk, perceived as an insult by the French consul, triggered a severe trade embargo by France. This economic pressure, coupled with long-standing French grievances over piracy and growing international condemnation of the Barbary states, culminated in a full-scale, fully resourced French invasion of Algiers in 1830. The French Expeditionary Force, led by General de Bourmont, faced fierce resistance from the Algerian defenders. However, French military technology and tactics ultimately proved superior. After a 3-month siege, Algiers fell to the French on July 5, 1830, marking a pivotal moment in the region's history. The French conquest of Algiers had a profound and lasting impact. The Dey was deposed, and French rule was established over the city. This event not only dismantled the power base of the Barbary pirates in Algiers, but also signaled the end of their long-standing stranglehold on the Mediterranean. While sporadic acts of piracy continued in the region for a few decades after, they were isolated incidents and lacked the organized structure and widespread support that had previously characterized Barbary piracy. The fall of Algiers, coupled with the earlier naval victories of the U.S. and other European powers, marked the permanent end of the Barbary pirates' reign of terror in the Mediterranean. Once a symbol of fear and uncertainty, the Barbary pirates now stand as a cautionary tale. A reminder that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can crumble in the face of united action. But the next time you take a cruise through the Mediterranean, keep an eye out for the sparkling azure waters, the ancient ruins clinging to dramatic cliffs, and the vibrant port towns bursting with culture and history. Remember, the tranquil beauty you are experiencing was once a contested space, and understanding the challenges of the past can make your journey even more enriching.
Thank you for listening. Please join me next time when we will delve into another episode.